everyone. My name is Joseph Sulia, and I will be distilling the essence of the 1872 notebooks of Nietzsche. For the most part, I will be commenting upon the text, putting it into my own words, and occasionally quoting the text directly, and occasionally interpolating my own thoughts. I will be moving very quickly, so you might want to pause the video from time to time. Let us begin. So, in the 1872 notebooks, Nietzsche tells us that genuine philosophizing begins when life attains its perfection. I surmise that Nietzsche thinks the same of creative production, although he doesn't exactly write that. Genuine creativity begins when life attains its perfection. So this, of course, raises the question, what is life in its perfect form? Well, Nietzsche does give us an indication of what this might be. The highest stage of existence, the highest stage of existence for Nietzsche is a concourse of three enterprises of the spirit: philosophy, art, and practical morality. This is the stage of genius, the concourse of all three of these enterprises of the spirit. Again, philosophy, art, and practical morality. Now, it might surprise some that Nietzsche is endorsing morality in these pages of the 1872 notebooks. But he does. Nietzsche endorses morality. It's as clear as day. Practical morality, which is to say good acts. So Nietzsche endorses good acts. We will return to this matter presently. Now, genius can only germinate in times of great danger. So genius can only germinate. It can only flourish, exfoliate, blossom in times of great danger. And history is a concatenation of stories. History is a concatenation of stories about geniuses, such as, and these are the names that Nietzsche returns to again and again: Goethe, Wagner, Schopenhauer. Every now and again, he, refers to Heine, he refers to Shakespeare, but those really form his triumvirate, right? His triumvirate of the spirit, his triumvirate of genius: Goethe, Wagner, Schopenhauer. He, of course, knew Wagner personally. Everyone else is in the background, right? Other than the genius, broadly understood. To paraphrase Schopenhauer, the geniuses are the giants, and everyone else is a dwarf. That's actually what Schopenhauer writes. The geniuses are the giants, and everyone else is a dwarf. The mountain range of geniuses is placed in the foreground of any great culture, right? So any great culture, according to Nietzsche, celebrates and affirms its geniuses. Everything else and everyone else is in the background. All of the non-geniuses are in the background, according to Nietzsche. So times of danger produce geniuses, philosophical geniuses, aesthetic geniuses. I would assume that there are also geniuses of practical morality, but Nietzsche does not write very much about them. He writes a little bit about them, and we'll return to that. So the philosopher discusses what a population needs. So the philosopher is like a doctor. The philosopher diagnoses what a culture needs, and the artist creates what that same population needs, what that same culture needs, what that same folk needs. In other words, the philosopher understands what a culture is lacking, and the artist gives that same culture what it is lacking, and thus accords it its meaning. To quote the German, Der Philosoph soll erkennen, was Not tut. Und der Künstler soll es schaffen. It's essentially what I just said. So genius, what is genius? Well, let's begin by saying what genius is not. Genius is not knowledgeableness, right? Genius is not doing well at Jeopardy, right? Nietzsche has no time for the unleashing of the appetite for more knowledge. He has no time for the epistemic hunger. The epistemic hunger, that is the crass desire to accumulate knowledge points, right? The crass desire to accumulate knowledge is for him as vulgar as the untrammeled sex drive. And indeed, Nietzsche analogizes the craving for absolute knowledge with sex addiction, erotomania, right? To quote the German, der Erkenntnistrieb ohne Auswahl steht gleich dem wahllosen Geschlechtstrieb Zeichen der Gemeinheit. So that's essentially what I said before. The point then is not to know as much as possible indiscriminately. Knowledge is not genius. Okay? In a great culture, unrestrained, untrammeled knowledge is contained. Limitless, indiscriminate knowledge is barbaric, and it barbarizes a population and its culture. As opposed to a person of indiscriminate knowledge, the philosopher poses the question, and this is what a genius is, at least what a philosophical genius is. I'm sure you want to know this. What is a philosophical genius, according to Nietzsche? So the philosopher poses the question, why do you want to know? Why do you want to know anything? That's the philosopher's question. Why do you want to know anything? Why is it valuable to know this thing, whatever this thing might be? What is the value of knowledge? What is the value of knowledge? What is the value of your knowledge? So uncontained, untrammeled, limitless, and illimitable, indiscriminate knowledge, such as artificial intelligence, AI, ChatGTP, CheatGTP, cannot distinguish between the high and the low. And I have noticed this. Obviously, Nietzsche died, he died over a century before artificial intelligence, AI, truly became a crescent, truly attained ascendancy, of course. But strangely, or perhaps not so strangely, Nietzsche prognosticated the advent of AI, of artificial intelligence. And I have noticed this, that artificial intelligence cannot distinguish between the high and the low, between what is valuable and what is not, what is valueless. AI does not care. AI does not care. Uncontained knowledge is the thoughtless accumulation of meaningless data without valuation, and according to Nietzsche, it must be controlled, should be controlled. It must be brought into alignment, to use an AI technologist term. It must be marshaled. Knowledge, uncontained knowledge, must be marshaled. It must be gelled, by which I mean put into a form, put into a shape, with contours, with strict boundaries. So how should knowledge be brought into alignment exactly, according to Nietzsche? By what? By art and by philosophy. By art and philosophy. Art and philosophy give knowledge form and purpose. To quote the German, der beherrschende Philosophie hat aber auch das Problem zu bedenken, bis zu welchem Grade der Wissenschaft wachsen darf. Sie hat den Wert zu bestimmen. Just to give you the essence of what I just said in German, reciting the text. Philosophy has as its task the determination, the ascertainment of the worth of knowledge. Like, why do we need to know this? I mean, that's every student's question, right? Why do we need to know this? Is this going to be on the test? Why are we talking about this? Why is my professor talking about her husband or his wife or his husband or her wife? Why is my professor talking about his or her personal life? I mean, that is a legitimate question that any student does ask and should ask. Like, what does this have to do with the class? How is this relevant to the class? So how does this happen? How does philosophy and art bring limitless, illimitable knowledge into alignment? How do philosophy and art limit the limitless drive to know, the limitless drive to know everything? Well, philosophy makes distinctions between the great and the small, between the macro and the micro, between the high and the low, between what is worth researching and what is not worth researching. Moreover, it asks, what is the value of life? Why is it important to live? Why is it better to live than not to live? Why is it better to live than to discontinue life, to die? And art? Art answers to the desire we human beings have for illusion. Now, some of us are illusion makers. Some of us enjoy creating illusions, right? Those of us who enjoy doing this are artists. But there are also members of the audience, although that multitude is shrinking, it seems, is contracting. But there are those who also have the desire to spectate illusions or to listen to illusions. And art suggests that life itself is an infinite cluster of infinite illusions. Let me say that again. Art suggests that life itself is an infinite cluster of infinite illusions. To quote the German, man muss selbst die Illusion wollen, darin liegt das Tragische. So one must desire, one must want the illusion. In this consists the tragic, loose translation. To say the same thing in a different way, knowledge must be restrained. How do we set limits on the thoughtless, limitless conglomeration of knowledge? Through philosophy, which asks, why do I need to know this thing? And how does this knowledge enhance my living? How should I live? How should I live? Tell me, philosopher. I'm really approaching this opinion myself. More and more, I want prescriptive philosophy, right? Philosophy that tells me how I should live my life. I actually want that. And there are some philosophers who do tell us how to live our lives. And at first, I hated these philosophers and philosophies. Now I understand that, no, it really is philosophy's task to tell us how we should live. I mean, that's far more interesting than merely making descriptive claims, describing how the world is. That has its place, but philosophy becomes very, very interesting once it tells you what to do. Not that you should obey a philosopher. No one's saying that. But it just gets more interesting when philosophers tell us how to live our lives. And through art, right? Now, art certainly should not tell anyone how to live one's life. I mean, the moment that art, and this is not Nietzsche really. I mean, he does write something similar elsewhere, but you know, art that tells you how to live is really propaganda, right? It's not art. But through art, which answers to the drive we have for illusions, not for knowledge. So art really isn't about knowing anything, right? It's about, I won't say satiating, but let's say maybe temporarily satisfying our desire for illusions, for a world of illusion. So why do we leash knowledge? Why do we leash knowledge? In order to make space for art, first of all, and for philosophy, second of all. You see, and this is very important to keep in mind because in the Nietzschean hierarchy, art is up here, philosophy is here, and practical morality is at the base of the pyramid, right? And the redeeming purpose of every culture is the works of art it produces. But now this raises a question. Can there be art without philosophy? It doesn't seem that way. Not for Nietzsche. It doesn't seem that way. No, I mean, if, as a matter of fact, Nietzsche is implying that art and philosophy need each other, but they don't need dead knowledge, right? They don't, art doesn't need dead knowledge. It could be like a saprophyte or a saprophage, which is an organism that feeds on the dead. It could feed on dead knowledge, but it doesn't need dead knowledge. Sepulchral knowledge, with its lack of proportionality, with its leveling off. The leveling off of knowledge, that is what AI does. That is what artificial intelligence does. When it is misapplied, as it almost always is. So knowledge for knowledge's sake is dead knowledge. But philosophy and art are productive, stimulatory, fortifying, fortitudinous. And one could ask me, well, stimulatory of what? Incitory of what? Incitory, inciting what? Life, furthering life. Not only is knowledge for knowledge's sake dead, such knowledge kills. Such knowledge kills. Nietzsche even tells us this. This is one of the most powerful statements in the totality of the 1872 notebooks. Humanity has in knowledge a beautiful means for its decline. Humanity has in knowledge a beautiful means for its decline. End of quotation. In German, die Menschheit hat an der Erkenntnis ein schönes Mittel zum Untergang. So culture grows into greatness when its proponents concern themselves not with the great effects of what is small, but with the small effects of what is great. And we should venerate what is great, namely genius and works of genius. The care of what is rare, right? The care of what is rare. For what is exceptional, and, the care for what is rare, the care for what is exceptional, is how a culture develops. Art, philosophy, and practical morality flow together. And this confluence is a great culture, or this confluence gives rise to a great culture. The purpose of any great culture is first to ensure that geniuses are not regarded as recluses or as outlaws. Secondly, to create great works of art. And great works of art are the most beautiful blooms of a great culture. Their final flourishings, their ultimate efflorescences. But why art? Why art again? Why art? why is art the highest form that a great culture takes? It's a legitimate question. What's so great about art? Because we only skitter across the surface of life. We only have a superficial understanding of ourselves. And there's actually a very useful word. It's a rare word that does describe this. It's called sciolism. 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 And the psi, the prefix psi, in Greek means shadow. So sciolism is superficial knowledge. Like it's not deep knowledge. It's just knowledge on the surface, right? Sciolistic is the adjective, and sciolist is a person who engages in superficial knowledge. But it's very interesting to think that, to recall that the psi in sciolism means shadow. So sciolism is shadowy knowledge, knowing shadowly. Very interesting. So we ourselves only know forms. We know shapes. We know surfaces, and art responds affirmatively to this limitation that is placed on human knowledge. Inherently, from within, there's an intrinsic limitation of human knowledge. So each of us is a plurality. Each of us is a plenitude. Each of us is a person of many parts. You can say even that each person is like a city of people, right? So each of us is a person of many parts, but most of those parts remain hidden from us, hidden from our view. Yeah, it's true that every person is a city of people, but how many of those people are we conscious of? That is the question. Looking at ourselves in the mirror is like looking into a crater, a dark, fathomless crater. We need illusion to ransom ourselves from this perilous self-gazing, this perilous self-regard. We need illusion in order to survive. We need illusion, the illusions that art provides, in order to save us from ourselves. In order to save us from ourselves. So the dictate of every society, of course, is exactly contrapositive, right? Society's dictate is, we need the truth in order to survive. We need the truth. Really? Do we? Well, to be sure, I mean, in order for any society to function, one must believe in the truth. You can't really have a society, I suppose, that isn't built on the belief in the truth. One must insist on the truth for communal existence to be possible, right? We have to insist that people tell us the truth. We have to believe in the truth. I mean, just think of it this way. I mean, do you think that society could function if we walked around knowing that everyone lies? I mean, if you thought that the person who was talking to you was lying, and that everyone who ever spoke to you is lying to you, is a liar, how would you be able to function? Well, most of us wouldn't be able to function if we were acutely conscious of the fact that everyone is lying to us. So society cannot be based on consciousness of the lie. If it is to function, I mean, otherwise it will dissolve and will no longer be a society. It certainly will no longer be a cohesive society. Socrates was purely theoretical, not aesthetic, which is one of the reasons why Nietzsche doesn't like him. Socrates insisted on the truth at all costs, right? And if you read Plato, who ventriloquize Socrates, you'll know that it's the truth that is the most important thing for Socrates. But artists lie, and that's probably why Plato didn't like them very much, because artists lie, and if they profit from their lies, then they're professional liars, right? Artists lie, and they are allowed to lie because their lies are considered to be harmless lies or even happy lies. To be absolutely clear, Nietzsche places art above knowledge of the truth in quotation marks. Why is this? Because art alone is honest, right? Art is honest, even though it is based on a lie. It reminds us of our own illusioning, of our own illusion-making capacity, of our own self-deceptiveness. And that's why artists can get away with lying. They can get away with lying to us because we get away with lying to ourselves. The human animal is a lying animal, a mendacious beast. Our senses lie to us all the time, right? Our senses lie. Our dreams lie to us when we sleep. We live out our life. We live out our lives immired in illusions. We live out our lives immired in illusion. And the pathos of the illusion that the universe circles around us, in the pathos of the illusion that the universe cares about us, which of course is an illusion. Unconscious thinking is thinking in images, right? Thinking in dreams, not in concepts. That's consciousness, right? Unconscious thinking is presentative. Presentative, in other words, that just means it's not conceptual, it's not intellectual, it's not conscious. Does art not suggest to us the fabrications of the unconscious mind? Of course it does. Art suggests to us not the conscious mind, but the unconscious mind. And the surrealists who emerged long after Nietzsche's death, well, almost 30 years after his death, they knew this. They knew this. Art betokens the unconscious mind. Art is compact of imagery without rationalization. The unconscious mind is compact of imagery without rationalization. Works of art and works of philosophy interleave. And let's talk about that. So how exactly does that happen? How is it that works of art and works of philosophy interleave? How do they come together? How so? Well, art, is all about images, right? Pictures. The artist manifests images in art. The philosophy substitutes concepts for imagery, right? Now, art is not a precise mode of seeing. It is an imprecise mode of seeing. Then again, seeing is an imprecise mode of seeing. When we look at ourselves in the mirror, and right now, I'm looking at myself in a digital mirror, a web camera, right? The image that is provided by a web camera. When we look at ourselves in the mirror, there are things that we overlook. We don't see all of us all at once. I know, Leonardo da Vinci invented the Hall of Mirrors, the Room of Mirrors. But even if we're in the mirrored room, we still can't see all of us all at once. When we look at ourselves in a mirror, there are things that we overlook. So there is a selectivity, a valuation in art Certain objects are chosen over other objects. But this has nothing to do with the truth. It's nothing to do with the truth. To summarize, art and philosophy restrict knowledge, and this is important because limitless knowledge is barbarizing and leads to pessimism. Why pessimism? Because illimitable knowledge, such as AI, such as the knowledge that is provided by AI, never needs to ask the question that every smart, self-reflective student asks oneself. Why do I need to know this? Why do I need to know this? But I haven't said very much about what Nietzsche understands as morality. And this is very interesting because, the popular conception of Nietzsche is that he was immoral or even amoral, which is not accurate. It's not accurate, but it is the case that, you really have to read a great deal of Nietzsche to find the passages in which he espouses his own morality, but it is there. And one of the things I like to do when I talk about Nietzsche or I write about Nietzsche is I like to point out how Nietzsche is a moralist. He's just not a traditional moralist. He believes we should be moral for different reasons than what the conventional moralists tell us. That's all. So it might surprise people to learn that Nietzsche makes a place for morality in his system of values, in his belief system, right? His value system. So how do we keep morality alive according to Nietzsche? Through duties, through mores, moral norms, through standards set by geniuses who always have powerful personalities. And isn't that the truth? Most of them do. Most geniuses have powerful personalities. By imitating their actions, we learn how to act. By imitating the actions of geniuses, we learn how to act. Now, I'm not so sure about this, though, if I may editorialize. This is not very wise advice from our man Nietzsche, I don't think, because if you know anything about the life of Schopenhauer, you might agree that he was not exactly an exemplar of moral sentiment. I mean, he did some things in his life that are highly questionable. Even Nietzsche in the notebooks, even he admits he could never imagine Schopenhauer as a professor. Schopenhauer was a professor very briefly, only for a few months. But Nietzsche writes he imagines students fleeing from Schopenhauer. And I could imagine that as well, But anyway. But then elsewhere in another passage, Nietzsche suggests to us that we should take a distance from our idols. Otherwise, they won't be our idols anymore, our lodestones. Okay, so we talked about the importance of philosophy. We talked about the importance of art. But now the question is, well, what exactly are the differences between philosophy, art, and science? Okay. I touched upon this a bit earlier, but just to really make this clear, a philosopher is like a scientist in that he or she traffics in abstractions, right? Concepts. But a philosopher is like an artist in a sense, in as much as he or she builds worlds in the imagination, constructs conceits of the world. So, in a sense, a philosopher is like a hybrid between a scientist and an artist, but he or she is neither a scientist, really, properly speaking, nor an artist. So a philosopher is speculative, suppositious, conjectural, concerned with notions, concerned with the perhaps, with what might be. This brings the philosopher in proximity to the artist. Now, Nietzsche is strictly against, we've covered this already, but he is strictly against knowledge for knowledge's sake because he doesn't consider the human to be the measure of all things, right? We, human beings, are not the measure of all things. To say it again, the greatest human power resides in aesthetic creativity, right? In artistic creativity, not in knowledge. I'm sure that you have met people who claim that the world is simple or that life is simple. I certainly have. No, the world is not simple, and life is not simple. Far from it. The world is overwhelmingly complex. Life is overwhelmingly complex. Anyone who claims that the world is simple is simplifying the world, decomplexifying the world. Such a person, in other words, is anthropomorphizing, projecting his or her simplicity onto the world and projecting his or her image of the human onto the world. So, I understand that mathematics might seem to be absolute truth, but let's really think of this for a minute. Those who claim that 2 plus 2 equals 4 is a universal truth are assuming that humanity is a universality. Humanity is universality. So think of it this way. So 2 plus 2 equals 4. For whom? For a buffalo? For a bison? For a giraffe? For a camel? For whom? I mean, we human beings, we do this all the time. We humanize the world, right? We anthropomorphize the world. But we also, and this is a much rarer word, but it is a word, we anthropopathize the world. Anthropopathize. Anthropopathize means to ascribe human feelings to what is unhuman. So what we do is we project our feelings onto the world as well. Why do we trust the world? Well, Nietzsche writes this. We trust the world because we want the world to trust us. We trust the world because we want the world to trust us. So I guess you could say it's a defensive mechanism. That seems to be what Nietzsche is implying here. Now, Nietzsche writes this twice in his notebooks. I love this statement. He's not, it seems like he's writing about dogs, but he's not really writing about dogs. He's drawing an implicit analogy. He's not really unraveling the analogy, which is what I'm trying to do. But anyway, he writes, a dog trusts its human owner because the dog wants the owner to trust him or her, right? So the dog trusts the owner because the dog wants the owner to trust the dog. What does Nietzsche mean by that? Well, I've already said it. He's drawing an analogy without spelling it out completely. We trust the world. For example, we pretend, we lie to ourselves. We pretend that the world is logical. The world is not logical. Why do we do that? Well, we want the world to trust us. Nietzsche tells us if we are of no concern to the universe, if the universe doesn't care about us, at least we can demand the right to despise it. I love that. If the universe doesn't care about us, well, at least we can demand the right to despise the universe. It's a great statement. Very powerful statement. The human mind is a mirror, right? It's a mirror, but it is a recently developed mirror, and it is still developing. I mean, how long have hominines been around? Homo sapiens and our predecessors. I mean, let's say we were to say 300,000 years. That's not a very long time because time is relative. 300,000 years is not a very long time if one considers the history of, even the planet Earth. So the human mind is a still developing mirror that is projective, that is transferential. The world to us is a human world because we are human, right? What this means, of course, is that the world seems human to us because we are human. Now, if you ask if a cucumber could talk, I don't know. I mean, who am I to say that cucumbers can't talk? Maybe cucumbers can't talk. But let's say if cucumbers could talk to us and we could understand cucumbers, the world to a cucumber is likely a cucumber world. So if cucumbers could tell us what the world is to the cucumber would probably tell us that the world is a cucumber world, right? The world to an ostrich is likely a struthionine world. Struthionine is a word which means like an ostrich. It's a good word to know. You can use it in everyday conversation. The next time you go to a party, feel free to use that word, struthionine. We metastasize our own image and apply it to the world, right? We transpose ourselves onto the world. And again, not just our image, but also our emotions or our feelings, broadly understood. Nietzsche suggests that philosophers anthropomorphize the world. They impinge their human, all too human metaphors onto the world. And Nietzsche makes the staggering point. It's so powerful that it makes us stagger. If a philosopher could utter a single word that would destroy the entire world, he or she would not restrain himself or herself from uttering it. So if a philosopher could say a word that would destroy the world, that philosopher would not restrain oneself from uttering it. It's very interesting. What Nietzsche seems to be suggesting here is that philosophy, very often, too often, metaphysical philosophy is world denying. It's world negating. Now, this might seem to be a contradiction, and there are self-contradictions in Nietzsche. But the philosophy that Nietzsche was talking about earlier, that he was writing about earlier, the philosophy that limits knowledge, this is not the same philosophy he's referring to here. If a philosopher had the chance to destroy the world with one word, he or she would not refrain from uttering that all destructive word. And I believe, I suspect, this is my interpretation, that Nietzsche is not talking about the philosophy that he endorses. He really is referring here, I'm sure of it, to metaphysical philosophy. And this is in the German. Wenn ein Wort fände, das ausgesprochen die Welt vernichten würde, glaubt ihr, spreche es nicht aus? Terrifying thought. Absolutely terrifying. Okay, to continue, Nietzsche and Kant, the German philosopher Immanuel Kant. Now, Nietzsche agrees with Kant to a point. He agrees that space and time are only real for sensate organisms, such as we are. Although, to be clear, Kant doesn't exactly write that. No, Kant does write that space and time only have a human meaning. They only have a human meaning in the Kritik der reinen Vernunft, in the Critique of Pure Reason. So time and space are human frameworks, human armatures, human structures that we impinge on the world. So Nietzsche and Kant are very close. We cannot know things as they are. We cannot know them at all. Nietzsche uses the same metaphor here that he uses elsewhere. Our forms of knowledge have the same relation to reality as figures inscribed in the sand have to sound. In other words, there is no relationship between human knowledge and reality, except for a relation of a non-relation. Our knowledge is relative, not absolute. The German philosopher Hegel certainly believed that absolute knowledge is possible. Nietzsche does not. I can't get into that, too closely, but just to say it, for Nietzsche now, we only know something if we are separate from it. So how could we ever know things as they are? We can't know things as we are. And in this, Nietzsche and Kant are consonant. They agree. And Hegel, again, he believed in absolute knowledge, but absolute knowledge would be knowledge without knowledge, right? Absolute knowledge. It's Hegel is such nonsense. Not all of Hegel. Much of it is nonsense. So Nietzsche and Kant converge on one point, at least, actually on two, right? So with respect to space and time, and also as to the question whether or not we can really know reality as it is. But Nietzsche breaks from Kant in as much as he gives up the project of knowledge altogether. So Nietzsche does not urge the project of knowledge. He urges the project of creation. Our greatness does not lie in knowing, but in creating. Our greatness lies in supreme semblance, in the noblest fervency of art creation. That is what Nietzsche means. So no artist should ever consider the preferences of the audience. And this is a red thread that runs throughout early Nietzsche, right? No artist should ever consider the preferences of the audience. And no genuine artist ever does. If I write a play, I am exuberant, right? I am ecstatically excited. I experience the exuberance of creation, right? But no one in the audience will ever experience my creation in the way that I experience it. If you are a painter, let's say that you paint a painting, will anyone ever be as enthusiastic about your painting as you are? Probably not. What does the audience matter then? Well, I think the answer is the audience doesn't matter one fig. And no artist should care a fig about the audience. Now, this is a very controversial point these days, in which, I don't know, it seems like every so-called artist is obsessed with the audience, presumably because they want money. But is that even art? Who cares about the audience? If you're an artist, who cares? Why do you care? No author should ever care about what a reader thinks of his or her writing. Shouldn't care about what readers think of your writing. Why do so many authors care about the impressions of readers and reviews on Goodreads, Amazon? Why do they care? Well, there is no reason for them to do so. There is no reason for them to care. And let us remind ourselves that the spectator or reader of a work of art wants to be deceived, expects to be deluded by the illusory world projected by the work of art. The one difference between the human animal, the human beast, and all other beasts is that the human beast is an analogizing beast. As far as we know, we are the only animals. We are animals, sure, but we are the only animals that draw analogies. Now, maybe this is not the case. Maybe a crocodile can draw an analogy. Maybe an Ashira cat analogizes. I don't know. But this is certainly what Nietzsche is suggesting. That is to say, we draw analogies, right? We metaphorize, we analogize, we construct metaphors, right? We analogize, we metaphorize, we explain one thing by way of another thing. That's essentially what Nietzsche means. We explain one thing by another thing. A metaphor is a way of explaining what we don't know by way of what we do know. We compare the unfamiliar, the unknown, with the familiar, with the known. And this impulse to refer the unfamiliar to the common is essential to humanity. Now, Nietzsche is certainly correct when he writes that. Certainly it's correct. Whether or not we are the only animals that can construct metaphors, well, we don't know yet, but I suspect with the preponderance, with the ascendancy of artificial intelligence, AI, we might very well know someday. Now AI is being used to decipher ancient languages. It's quite amazing, you know. And I expect it is only a matter of time before AI acquires a degree of sophistication that will allow it to translate the languages of animals. Now, this might not happen. And, you know, there's no question that the AI makes mistakes, it certainly does. I could give you examples of this. I have discovered many, many mistakes that are made by ChatGTP, although some claim that ChatGTP, or as I call it, CheatGTP, is not even AI because it siphons its information from the internet. There are those who argue, and they argue that only agentic artificial intelligence is real AI, but we'll leave that aside. Although I know it might seem like I'm being tangential, but really I want to keep on returning to AI because one of my hypotheses is that in the 1872 notebooks, Nietzsche is prognosticating the advent of AI. So this might seem to be a tangent. It might seem to be irrelevant. It is not. It is completely relevant to what I'm talking about here. So knowledge is the drawing of analogies. For instance, we analogize the sensation of touch with optical imagery, right? We say, oh, touch is like sight. They belong to Aristotle's five senses. Now, neuroscientists tell us that we have at least 25 senses, right? And then we say that sight and touch are both senses, but these are two entirely different phenomena. Right? You know, sight and touch are not, they're not the same. Are they similar? Are they comparable? Well, maybe, but if you say that two things are similar, you're implying that they're different, right? Similarity implies difference. So what we're doing is we're saying these two different things are connected, they're connectable, but that implies difference. To continue, Thales, the Greek philosopher Thales, claimed that everything is water, right? He wrote, everything is water. But by making this claim, he was thinking compositionally, right? This is the fallacy of composition. It's like the idea that because one thing is a certain way, that means everything is a certain way. Everything that is adjacent is the same way. So Nietzsche is really criticizing Thales, Thales. He was saying some things are water, Thales was. This means that everything is water. Well, that's just nonsense. It's just nonsense. Of course, such an argument is inferentially false. But we do this sort of thing all the time. Knowledge is nothing but a playing around with metaphors, according to Nietzsche. It's a playing around with metaphors. But we forget that the metaphors are metaphors. But what does metaphorizing have to do with the truth? The answer, absolutely nothing. We have to believe in the truth in order to survive, to be sure, but there is something more fundamental than a truth, much less the truth, and that is the desire for something to be true, right? The emotional need for something to be true. And what if all of our truths were based upon desire? And isn't Nietzsche suggesting that all of our truths are based on desire? He is. He is suggesting that. Belief in the truth comes from a social need. Without the illusion of truth, one human being distrusts another, which is deleterious to social formation. We talked about this earlier. So truth emerges from an emotional necessity, right? The idea of the truth emerges from an emotional need. We have the desire for the truth because being together with others would be unendurable without belief in the truth. We have the emotional need to believe in the fathomability of the world and metastasize that need onto the world. In so doing, we prove nothing other than our own emotional need. Too much knowledge is dangerous, Nietzsche is telling us. And this is very interesting. It is knowledge that will bring about the decline, the decrescence of humanity. And with the disappearance of the human species, our knowledge will disappear concomitantly. Think of AI. Now, believe me, I see value in AI. I think AI confers many benefits. Or maybe not many benefits, but AI does have certain benefits. I have experienced it. AI can be astonishing and it can be very, very useful. If you write a script and you use AI to synthesize imagery, why would I have a problem with that? Why would anyone have a problem? But AI could run wild. AI could run wild, and we're already seeing evidence of AI running wild. We're already seeing evidence of this. Human beings build machines, which is a form of knowledge. You see how this is relevant. And then the machines reject the creators, the human creators. Frankenstein or the postmodern Prometheus. That's where we are right now. To get back to the truth, all so-called truths are metaphors, according to Nietzsche. They're all metaphors. All truths are metaphors, according to Nietzsche. Why? Why is this? Well, all truths are metaphors because they are identifications of concepts that are non-identical, right? They are identifications of concepts that are different. The word metaphor means transference, right? A metaphor is a transference from one concept to another. If I say, her mind is the state of Indiana, I am conflating, telescoping her mind, whoever she is, whoever she might be, with the state of Indiana. So I'm taking these two things that are unrelated and I'm making them connectable. I'm synthesizing. If I say or if I write, a rock is petrified matter, I am using a metaphor. I am also giving a tautologous circular definition. I am moving in a circle. And if I assume that the word rock, has something to do with an object that I name rock, I am metaphorizing. That is, I am interfusing the concept of a rock with a thing which I pretend is a totality. And if I say or I write, oh, all rocks are petrified matter, I'm first of all assuming that there is something called a rock. There's something called a rock. But this is just an anthropomorphism. This is an anthropomorphism. It's a human concept. But secondly, I am ignoring individual differences that would separate one so-called rock from another so-called rock. If I say or write an American robin and a toucan are birds, I am discarding the individual differences between a so-called American robin or so-called American robins and so-called toucans. Language always lies, and whenever we speak, we lie, and whenever we write, we lie. If I say or write, time slips by, I'm making a metaphor. I'm constructing a metaphorical statement. I'm metaphorizing. I'm using the metaphor of slippage to describe time. If I say life is a journey, I'm also metaphorizing. I'm representing life metaphorically as a journey. I'm explaining what I do not know, life, right? by way of what I do, by way of what I do know, the journey. I'm explaining what I don't know, life, by way of what I do know, the journey. But I'm not getting at the so-called truth because there is no truth, according to Nietzsche. Let me pause for a moment. So, what is the truth? What is truth? What do most people consider to be the truth? What is true is a metaphor that concords with the majority, right? What is true is a metaphor that is consonant with the majority. What is true is what most people regard as true. That is it. That is all. The truth is what is consonant with the common interpretation of things, what masses of people understand as the true. What is true is what is held as normal. What is true is what is held as normal, but there is no such thing as the monolithic and megalithic truth. So the truth, in quotation marks, is a familiar metaphor that most forget as a metaphor, such as time flies by or life is a journey. Again, there is an emotional need to believe in the truth. We need to believe in the truth in order to survive, in order to survive. But this doesn't mean that the truth exists. The drive to invent new metaphors, however, is the drive to poeticize, the drive to write poetry. What is poetry? It's the desire, at least, to invent new metaphors. The drive to invent new metaphors vents itself through the poet. And that, I think, is the best and clearest definition of poetry I have ever read or heard. Poetry gives us unfamiliar figures, right? Poetry gives us unfamiliar figures. An unfamiliar figure is provocative. It is stimulatory. It is interesting. Poetic language is compact of unfamiliar figures. Does this mean that human beings, who are the comparative beasts, are poetic animals? Are we human beings poetic animals? Nietzsche does not write this explicitly, but he almost writes it. Now, political language, politics, and morality use common metaphors. An uncommon metaphor destabilizes political and moralistic language. An uncommon metaphor destabilizes political and moralistic language. All of this to say that human beings, we human beings, are illogical. We are not what Aristotle said we are. You know, Aristotle, of course, said, he didn't write, he said this, and his students wrote it down. You know, you've heard this, I'm sure. What is a human being? Well, he once called a human being a featherless biped, but that's we're not going to talk about that right now. But Aristotle said that the human being is the rational animal. No, we're not. We are the irrational animal. Human beings are the illogical beast. We are illogical, irrational beasts. We subsume individual entities under general categories, general rubrics, and then pretend that we are saying something factual, right? So we take individual things, we put them beneath broad categories, and then we just pretend we're saying something true. In actuality, we are anthropomorphizing, right? Humanizing. We are putting human forms onto things and onto other organisms. We are anthropopathizing, attributing human emotions to things and to other organisms, right? Nietzsche uses the example of the tree to evince and to limn how truth is a metaphor. What we call a tree is really a plenitude of qualities, right? What we call this tree is plenitudinous and multitudinous. It is many parts, but we pretend that this so-called tree is a unified thing, a totality, and we pretend that the word tree names its essence. We forget that we are the constructors of the fabrication that we call tree. And by using the word tree, we are assuming that all so-called trees are alike, share an essence, hold something essential in common. By doing so, we ignore the nuances, the individual differences that separate one so-called tree from another so-called tree. Again, truth is a metaphor, the metaphoricity of which has been obliviated, has been forgotten. We traffic in metaphors all the time. We traffic in metaphors all the time and forget that they are metaphors. Individuality, singularity, uniqueness. This is the only measure for Nietzsche. And he tells us that our experiences determine our individuality. The emotional impress of every experience we have impinges on us and shapes our individualities. Everything that happens to you leaves a mark on you. Everything that happens to you leaves a mark upon you. To put it another way, our judgments about the world are synthetic and therefore false. I compare two things that are fundamentally dissimilar, essentially discordant, essentially discontinuous whenever I claim to know something, right? Whenever I claim to know something, I'm comparing two things that are fundamentally different. If I say, I am holding a book, I assume synthetically, and therefore falsely, that the concept of a book has something to do with this thing that I'm holding in my hands. But the word book is one thing, and this object is quite another. And the concept of a book is one thing, and the object is quite another. Does Nietzsche believe in God? Does Nietzsche believe in God? It is not the case that Nietzsche de-deifies the world. He never tells us that God does not exist. Never once has he ever said that God does not exist. He did write in Human All Too Human that there is no evidence for the existence of God or a God. Sure. But he also writes that the possibility of a God could scarcely be denied. It's just that God is otherwise. He never writes that there is no God. He never writes that God does not exist. He even writes that the possibility of a God could never be denied, could scarcely be denied. The point is that we only know surfaces without depth, illusions without truth. In the 1872 notebooks, Nietzsche spends no time disenchanting religion, strangely. This goes against the cliche that people have of Nietzsche. He spends his time de-dogmatizing science and de-dogmatizing philosophy in favor of what? As we've seen, in favor of art. Art, which reminds us that the world is an infinite cluster, a limitless constellation of shifting illusions. So, all concepts are based on a lie, that what is different can be identical. Whenever we think we know something, we take two things that are fundamentally different, entirely different, and pretend that they are the same. Well, they might be similar. That doesn't mean they're the same. Similarity and sameness are not identical concepts. Now, there's an example that Nietzsche gives that I think is very clear and very illuminating. Take Nietzsche's own example of walking. Walking, okay? We call human ambulation walking, right? We call it walking. But if an ape moves past us, why do we call that walking? Why do we say, well, there's an ape walking by? Why do we say that? When a dog moves past us, why do we call that walking? Oh, look, there's a dog walking past us. Why does the concept of walking apply indifferently to how a human being moves from place to place, how an ape moves from place to place, and how a dog moves from place to place? These three kinds of movement are not the same, yet we give them all the same name, walking. To quote the text directly, I'm going to quote it in English and then in German. The concept arises. When he writes this, he means any concept. It's much clearer in the German, which I will read. The concept arises from an equalization of the non-equal, i.e., through the illusion that there is an equal, through the assumption of identities, thus through false perceptions. Okay, so this is the same statement in German for my German speaking, German writing listeners, German understanding listeners. Der Begriff entsteht aus einem Gleichsetzen des Nichtgleichen. Das heißt, durch die Täuschung, es gäbe ein Gleiches, durch die Voraussetzung von Identitäten, also durch falsche Anschauungen. All right. Now, I'm actually going to conclude not with Nietzsche, but with Goethe, the great Goethe. Nietzsche quotes part of the passage that I'm going to read. This is a relevant passage. It's relevant to the 1872 notebooks of Nietzsche. And this passage from Goethe, not Nietzsche, is dated 1783. 1783. It concerns nature. I will read it in the German and then I will translate it to the best of my ability, although I would argue that Goethe is much more difficult to translate than Nietzsche, but I'll do my best. So this is the German first. Sie spielt ein Schauspiel. Ob sie es selbst sieht, wissen wir nicht, und doch spielt sie es für uns, die wir in der Ecke stehen. Ihr Schauspiel ist immer neu, weil sie immer neue Zuschauer schafft. Leben ist ihre schönste Erfindung und der Tod ist der Kunstgriff, viel Leben zu haben. So to translate this into English, now that's nature, okay? Nature is performing a play. Whether she sees it herself, we don't know. And yet she is performing it for us, we who are standing in the corner. So nature is performing a play for we who, I guess, are cowering in the shadows. We're cowering in the corner, standing in the corner. Her play, again, this is nature's play. Nature's play is always new. Her play is always new because she's always creating new spectators. Life is her most beautiful invention, and death is her trick to have so much life. Life is nature's most beautiful invention, and death is her trick to have so much life. I have to tell you, these words of Goethe are quoted by Nietzsche in his 1872 notebooks 101 years after Goethe wrote them. And they are, I hate to admit it, more powerful, more beautiful, and more profound than anything Nietzsche writes in these pages. I'm very sorry to say that. But yeah, that is the case. Now, let me conclude by this might be as good as a place as any. Now might be a good place to discuss Derrida, who is a charlatan, a dissembler, an empiric, a fraudster. Derrida is Jacques Derrida. Derrida did not take a single step beyond Nietzsche. In fact, Derrida is nothing more than a Franco-Nietzschean. Derrida translated Nietzsche into French effectively without telling us he was doing that, and pretended that Nietzsche's real insights were Derrida's. Derrida Frenchified Nietzsche and Wittgenstein. That is all. That is all Derrida did. When I was a student, I listened to him speak twice on two different occasions. He is an empiric. He is a dissembler. He is a charlatan, a fraud, a fraudster. Derrida tells us repeatedly in so many words that the fundamentals of metaphysics are assumed to be transcendent, yet they are immanent. There is no signified apart from the network of signifiers. Each signified is a part of the network of signifieds. There is no identity without difference. There is no meaning without language. Well, that's all well and good, but this is the same thing that Nietzsche wrote much earlier, that every ideal is bound up with the muckiness and the raggedness of the world. Every time someone brings up Derrida, I shake my head in bafflement. Derrida is at best, again, a Frenchifier of Nietzsche. At worst, he is a pompous hack and a prevaricatory witch doctor. Thank you very much. My name is Joseph Sulia, signing out and signing off. Thank you.